Let me tell you about a cold, gray morning in the last week of October 1983 in a place called Wallace County, Kansas, out where the high plains run flat and pale all the way west until the ground starts to tilt up toward the Colorado border. If you have never stood in Wallace County in the fall, picture a sky the color of beat aluminum, a wind out of the northwest at a steady 18 miles per hour, harvested wheat stubble running to the horizon in every direction in pale yellow rows, a cottonwood here or there, bare against that pale sky, and a temperature sitting at 31 degrees at 7:30 in the morning. The kind of cold that hasn't gotten serious yet, but has put a thin frost on every fence wire and every steel implement that spent the night out in a yard. Just outside the town of Sharon Springs, on a quarter section of pasture, leased for the day from a fellow named Vern Pickett, somebody had put up two long blue and white striped auction tents, end to end. There was a cardboard sign at the gate, hand-lettered in black paint, that read, Hollander Estate Auction. Today, 8 a.m. Equipment, real estate, household. There were 120-some men in that yard by 7:45 in the morning, in tan Carhartt coats and brown work coats and dirty western hats, and a Kenworth hauler with a flatbed parked out by the front gate ready to take loads anywhere east of Hayes. There was the smell of diesel fuel and percolated coffee and somebody's burning trash barrel 2 pastures over. There was the slow scuffle of boots on cold dust. And under it all, the specific kind of quiet that comes off a yard full of men who have come to buy another man's life for 40 cents on the dollar. Now, you have to understand what was happening in that part of the country that fall. The farm crisis had been grinding through the wheat belt for 3 years already. Land values were down 25% from their 1979 peak. Wheat was bringing $3.12 at the elevator in Sharon Springs, when it cost $3.70 to grow it. There were 41 foreclosure filings on the books at the Wallace County Courthouse in 1983 alone. And that was only the ones that had ripened all the way to a sale. There were 110 more in some stage of trouble. Out where the Hollander place sat, 8 miles south of Sharon Springs on the gravel road that ran down to the Smoky Hill River, a man's whole life could end on a Tuesday morning in October between coffee and lunch. And that morning, 120 men had driven in from as far west as Burlington, Colorado, and as far east as Hayes, Kansas, to watch one such ending. The bank that morning was the Wallace County Citizens Bank, and the bank's man on site was a young loan officer named Bryce Mallory. Bryce was 33 years old, 5'11", lean, with slicked-back light brown hair, a clean-shaven jaw, brown eyes behind a pair of gold-rimmed glasses, a brown 3-piece J.C. suit, a beige dress shirt with a brown necktie striped in cream, brown loafers polished within an inch of their life, and a brown leather clipboard with the Hollander operating loan file clipped to it. Bryce had been with the bank 20 months. The Hollander file was his first big estate. He intended for the bank to recover not less than 70% of the outstanding balance by the end of the day, and he had told his boss in Hayes the night before that he was confident he would. The big man in that yard, the one everybody kept glancing toward, was a rancher named Whit Kearney. Whit was 55 years old, 5'10", stocky and ruddy, with a thick brown mustache, a thin gold tooth on the right side of his smile, a stained brown felt cowboy hat pulled down low over a sunburned brow, a tan canvas Carhartt coat that had been mended at the elbows with brown tape, brown corduroy pants tucked into mud-streaked black Dan Post boots, and a set of black leather gloves stuffed into his back pocket. Whit owned 640 acres of grass north of the Hollander place, and he had been waiting on the 1973 John Deere 443 in that yard for 4 months. He had told 3 men in the coffee line that morning that he was going to take it home for under $12,000. He had told a 4th man, a fellow named Lyle Bostic, that he intended also to take the 8-row planter and the home quarter of Section 28, if the bank would let it go cheap. He thought there was an even chance of it. Now, into that yard, at 6 minutes past 8, walked a woman. She came up the gravel drive on foot, having parked her dark green 1976 Chevrolet Caprice station wagon out by the gate next to the Kenworth. She was 5'4", slight, maybe 110 pounds in winter clothes, with a long fall of iron gray hair pinned in a low, neat bun at the nape of her neck, pale, faded blue eyes, a gentle lined face with kind crow's feet at the corners of her eyes, and a small, soft black leather purse with a brass clasp held in front of her at both hands, the way a woman might hold a hymnal. She was wearing a long, dark navy wool overcoat that came down past her knees, with the original silver-tone buttons all buttoned up the front, a black wool skirt beneath the coat hem, opaque black stockings, sensible black low-heeled lace-up shoes, and a small black felt hat pinned at an angle on her hair. The wedding ring on her left ring finger was a plain gold band she had been wearing for 34 years. Her name was Edith Hollander. She was 58 years old. She was the widow of the man whose life was being sold off in that yard. Her husband, Donovan Patrick Hollander, a wheat farmer of 640 acres, had died of a sudden heart attack 5 months and 3 weeks earlier, on the morning of May the 7th, 1983, walking from the kitchen door of their home out to the barn at 4:15 in the morning to start the spring fertilizer. He had been 61 years old. He had been dead before he hit the gravel. Edith Hollander had not spoken at his funeral, and she had not spoken much at all in the 5 months since. She had come that morning to the auction without telling anyone she was coming, and she had walked up the gravel drive past 120 men in tan Carhartt coats and dirty hats, and she had walked over to the registration table at the entrance to the front tent, and she had signed her name in the auction book in a small, slow, careful hand. And the registration clerk, a young woman named Marlene Voth, had handed her a bitter paddle of plain white cardstock with a hand-painted black number 19 on the front. Edith had thanked her and walked to an empty folding chair in the 3rd row from the back and sat down. She had set the paddle across her knees. She had folded her gloved hands in her lap. She did not look around. She just sat. Whit Kearney saw her before she was halfway to her chair, and Whit nudged Lyle Bostic in the side, and Whit said out loud, "Well, I'll be damned, Lyle. Edith Hollander come to her own auction." And Lyle Bostic looked over and saw her and shook his head. And the man on the other side of Lyle, who was a feed store owner from Sharon Springs named Cole Embry, looked over and saw her and gave a small, low laugh. And by the time Edith Hollander had sat down in her folding chair in the 3rd row from the back with paddle 19 across her lap, there were probably 15 men in that tent who had glanced once at her and then quietly at the other men, with the look that men give each other when they all already know something, and the look that men give each other when they have all decided already what they think. Now, before I tell you what happened next, I want you to understand something about Edith Hollander and the man whose estate was being auctioned that morning. Because the letter folded inside her purse that morning is the whole story. Donovan Hollander, who everybody had called Don, had been a Wallace County wheat farmer all his life. His grandfather, Patrick Hollander, had come up from Ellis County in 1903 to file a claim on a quarter section of grass south of where the town of Sharon Springs would later be. His father, Amon Hollander, had grown the place to 480 acres by the time he died in 1955. Don had taken it over at 33 years of age and had grown it again to a section and a quarter, 640 acres of wheat ground and 160 acres of pasture by the time he was 45. He had been a big man, 6'2", broad-shouldered and tanned, with thick salt and pepper hair, a heavy brown mustache, blue eyes set deep under heavy brows, and the kind of laugh that filled a room when something struck him. He had been married to Edith for 33 years. They had one child, a son named Calvin, born in November of 1961, who had moved to Wichita in 1980 to take a job as a stockyards bookkeeper and who would arrive that night on the late bus. Too late to do his mother any good at the auction. Don Hollander had bought the 1973 John Deere 4430 tractor in April of that year on a 4-year note from the John Deere dealer in Goodland, paying $19,200 for it new. With a 110 horsepower power quad transmission, dual rear wheels, an enclosed sound guard cab, and a fresh coat of John Deere green and yellow paint that the salesman, a man named Stan Crabtree, had personally rubbed down with rouge before he handed Don the keys. Don had paid the note off in 3 years. He had used the 4430 for 10 harvests. He had put 4,620 hours on it. He had taught his boy Calvin how to drive that tractor in 1975, when Calvin was 13. He had pulled the 8-row planter behind it every spring and the chisel plow behind it every fall, and he had set it for the last time on the morning of May the 7th, 1983, against the south side of the implement barn with the keys in the ignition and the door cracked open, before he had walked back toward the house at 4:15 in the morning to fetch his thermos and never made it back. Now, you have to understand something about Don Hollander, which was that his father Amon had died of a heart attack at the age of 58, walking out to feed the cattle on a December morning in 1955, and his Uncle Vincent, who had been Amon's younger brother, had died of a heart attack at the age of 60, walking up the stairs of the Wallace County Courthouse in 1964. Don Hollander had known all his adult life that he had a hard family heart and that he was unlikely to see 70. He had not told Edith. He had not told Calvin. He had told one man in his life, and that was Carl Yates, who at the time was a 28-year-old insurance agent newly hired at the State Farm Mutual office in Goodland, Kansas, and who in November of 1961, 3 weeks after Don's only son had been born, had agreed to write Don a private whole-life policy in the amount of $40,000 on the life of Donovan Hollander. Premium payable $44 a month for as long as Don could keep it up. Beneficiary Edith Marie Hollander. No medical examination required at that level of coverage. Don had paid the premium every month for 21 years and 7 months. The $44 came out of the cattle account, not the wheat account, because Edith never looked at the cattle account. Over those 21 years and 7 months, the policy had built cash value, and Carl Yates had quietly bumped the face amount 3 separate times when Don's cattle income was good. By the spring of 1983, the death benefit on that policy stood at $212,000. The first week of May, 1983, Don Hollander had felt a tightness in his chest while he was changing the oil on the 4430, the kind of tightness he had felt twice before that spring and had never told Edith about. And he had walked into the house that night. And he had sat down at the kitchen table with a number 2 pencil and a sheet of yellow school-ruled paper, and he had written Edith a letter. He had folded the letter into thirds. He had put it inside a plain, white, legal-size envelope. He had sealed the envelope with the tongue of his own mouth. He had written on the front of the envelope, in pencil, in his slow, careful capital letter print, the words, "For Edith if I am gone." And he had walked it into the front parlor of the farmhouse, and he had slipped it into the back inside cover of the family Bible on the small oak side table by his reading chair. And he had not said a word about it to anybody. And 4 days later, he had died on the gravel between the kitchen door and the implement barn at 4:15 in the morning. Edith Hollander had found that envelope on the 3rd Saturday of October, 1983, while she was cleaning the front parlor. She had taken it into the kitchen. She had set it on the table. She had not opened it for 2 hours. She had made a pot of coffee. She had set out 2 cups, one for her and one for the empty chair across from her, the way she had done every morning since Don died. And then she had opened the envelope, and she had read the letter, and she had read the letter again, and she had taken it down to the State Farm Mutual office in Goodland that next Monday morning and laid it on Carl Yates's desk. And Carl Yates had read it, and Carl Yates had nodded once, and Carl Yates had said, in a quiet voice, "Mrs. Hollander, it is true. Every word of it is true. The check will be cut to your name as soon as the death certificate clears probate. The cash value, which is liquid as of today, is $61,420, payable on your signature at our bank in Goodland today." And Edith Hollander had signed the form Carl pushed across the desk to her, and Carl Yates had walked her over to the First National Bank of Goodland that same morning, and the cashier had handed her a cashier's check made out to Edith M. Hollander in the amount of $61,420. And Edith had folded the check into the inside pocket of her dark navy wool overcoat, and she had driven home alone, and she had not told a living soul about it. So that is the woman in the dark navy overcoat. The men in that yard were nudging each other about the morning of October the 25th, 1983. When Edith Hollander walked into the Hollander Estate auction in Wallace County, Kansas, and sat down in the 3rd row from the back with paddle number 19 across her knees and a folded letter from her dead husband, sealed inside a white legal-size envelope, riding inside the soft black leather purse on her lap. The auctioneer that morning was a man named Reese Tibbetts. Reese was 60 years old, 6 foot, ruddy, with a thick salt and pepper handlebar mustache, dark gray eyes that had seen 1,000 of these things, a tan western suit jacket over a pressed white pearl snap shirt, dark gray wool slacks, polished black cowboy boots, and a cream felt hat with a black band. Reese had been calling auctions out of Sharon Springs since 1958. He had known Don Hollander since the two of them were boys. He had buried his own wife in 1979. He had no patience for the kind of laughter that had moved through the front part of that tent when Edith had walked in, and he had looked once, slowly, across the front 3 rows, and then he had stepped up to the microphone on the wooden podium up front, and he had called the room to order. He started with the small lots. A set of Stanley hand tools went for $42 to a man in a green John Deere cap. An old Maytag wringer washer went for $25 to nobody in particular. A pallet of leftover fence post insulators went for $12. Reese worked through household goods and shop equipment for about 40 minutes, and the room warmed up and the laughter eased, and Edith Hollander sat in the 3rd row from the back with paddle 19 across her knees and did not bid on any of it. She did not bid on the Maytag. She did not bid on her own kitchen table. She did not bid on the framed photograph of her son Calvin at his high school graduation. She just sat. At 10 minutes past 9, Reese called the equipment. He called the 8-row International Harvester planter first. It went to a man from Tribune named Brock Whittaker for $9,400. He called the John Deere 6620 combine. It went to a partnership out of Burlington for $28,000. He called a 1968 Massey Ferguson 165 utility tractor, which went to Whit Kearney for $3,200. He called a Ford F 700 grain truck. It went for $6,100. And then, at 22 minutes past 9, Reese Tibbetts read the description for the 1973 John Deere 4430. He read off the model number. He read off the hours, 4,620 on the meter. He read off the dual rear wheels and the power quad transmission and the sound guard cab and the recent serviceable condition note from the John Deere dealer in Goodland. He named the opening bid at $4,000. Whit Kearney raised his paddle at $4,000. A man named Eldon Pruitt from Waukene raised at $5. Whit raised at $6. Eldon raised at $7. Whit raised at $8. Eldon looked at his hat and dropped out. Cole Embry from the feed store raised at $9. Whit raised at $10. Cole shook his head and stopped. Reese Tibbetts lifted the gavel. He said, "Going once at $10,000 to bidder number 44. He said going twice. And then in the 3rd row from the back, paddle number 19 came up. The room went quiet for one beat, the way it does. And then somebody in the 3rd row from the front gave a small, distinct laugh. And then Cole Embry laughed. And then Whit Kearney turned around in his folding chair and looked at the woman in the dark navy overcoat sitting in the back 3rd of the tent with her small black purse on her lap. And Whit Kearney smiled with his thin gold tooth on the right side of his mouth, and Whit Kearney said out loud, loud enough for 30 men around him to hear, "Edith, honey, now what in the world are you going to do with Don's tractor? You ain't even got a man to drive it." And the laughter went up 2 notches, and 3 or 4 men slapped their knees, and the auctioneer, Reese Tibbetts, who had known Don Hollander since they were both boys, throwing rocks at fence posts in 1934, brought the back of his weathered hand down on the wooden podium hard enough that the microphone jumped, and Reese said into the microphone in a low voice, "Mr. Kearney, we will conduct this auction with respect for every bidder. Bidder 19 is at $11,000. Whit Kearney looked at Reese. Whit Kearney looked at Edith. Whit Kearney raised at 12. Edith raised at 13. Whit raised at 14. Edith raised at 15. Whit Kearney did a slow piece of math in his head, and he raised at 16. Edith raised at 17. Whit looked at Lyle Bostick. Whit raised at 18. Edith raised at 19. Whit said out loud, "Now, hell." Whit raised at 20. There was a pause. In the third row from the back, in the small, slow, careful motion of a woman who has been working a needle and thread for 54 years, Edith Hollander unclasped the brass clasp on the soft black leather purse on her lap. She drew out a single folded sheet of yellow school-ruled paper inside a plain, white, legal-size envelope that had been opened along the top edge. She unfolded the paper. She held it open in her left gloved hand. She raised paddle 19 with her right gloved hand, and then, in a quiet, steady voice that did not reach past the 8th row, but that the front of the tent could hear, because the rest of the tent had gone dead silent, Edith Hollander spoke for the first time that morning. She said, "Mr. Tibbets, before I bid again, I would like the auctioneer's permission to read 4 lines out loud from a letter my husband wrote in his own hand on the night of May the 2nd of this year, 5 days before he died, 5 months before this auction." Reese Tibbets looked at her. He looked at Whit Kearney. He looked back at Edith. He said, in a voice the whole tent could hear, "Mrs. Hollander, you go right ahead." Edith Hollander turned her gloved hand to catch the light from the open tent flap, and she read. She said, "My Edith, if you are reading this, I am gone before the harvest. I have been quietly putting $44 a month into a private whole life policy with Carl Yates at the State Farm Mutual office in Goodland since the fall of 1961. The policy is paid up to $212,000. Bid on the tractor yourself. Do not be afraid of what they will think of you for it." She folded the letter once. She put it back into the envelope. She put the envelope back into the purse. She closed the brass clasp. She looked at Reese Tibbets, and she raised paddle 19, and she said, "I am at 21,000. There was no sound in that tent. Not a chair scraped. Not a man coughed. Whit Kearney was looking at Edith Hollander like a man trying to figure out if what he had just heard was a thing that had really happened in his own life. Reese Tibbets looked at the bank's man, Bryce Mallory, who was standing at the side of the podium with his clipboard. Bryce Mallory looked at Reese Tibbets. Bryce Mallory said in a tight voice, "I will need to verify the policy before this auction continues, Mr. Tibbets." And Reese Tibbets said, in a voice almost gentle, "Then I would say you had better verify it, Mr. Mallory. There is a pay phone at the Phillips 66 on the corner. Carl Yates is the man you want. State Farm Mutual in Goodland. I will call a 15-minute recess." Bryce Mallory walked out of that tent at the pace of a man who has been told something he does not yet believe and who needs to confirm it before he believes it. The tent did not move. Whit Kearney slowly took his stained brown felt cowboy hat off his head and held it on his thigh. Eldon Pruitt looked at his hat. Cole Embry stared at the back of Edith Hollander's small black felt-pinned hat. The 2 men sitting in the second row, who had been Don Hollander's neighbors to the east for 30 years, turned around and looked at Edith with wet eyes, and one of them stood up out of his folding chair and walked back through the rows and laid one rough, calloused hand on Edith Hollander's shoulder for the count of 3 seconds, and he did not say anything, and he walked back to his chair and sat down. Edith Hollander did not turn around. She nodded once. She folded her gloved hands in her lap. 11 minutes later, Bryce Mallory walked back into the tent. His face was the color of paper. He went up to the podium, and he spoke into Reese Tibbets's ear for the count of 15 seconds. Reese nodded once. Reese tapped the microphone. Reese said, "Carl Yates confirms the policy. We are at 21,000 from bidder 19. Will the bidder at 20,000 re-enter at 22? He looked at Whit Kearney. Whit Kearney did not raise. Reese Tibbets brought the gavel down on the wooden podium. He said, "Sold to bidder 19 at $21,000. The 1973 John Deere 443. Oh, with all attached implements and the 8-row planter previously declared as a related lot under the Hollander estate." Reese raised his head and looked across the room. He said, "Mr. Whitaker of Tribune, Mr. Whitaker, your $9,400 bid on the planter will be refunded by the bank within the hour. I am returning the planter to bidder 19 at the bank's expense as a condition of the second clause of the estate listing, which was not properly disclosed at the opening of this auction. Mr. Mallory has confirmed." Brock Whitaker of Tribune nodded once, slowly, like a man who has watched the air leave a kite. Bryce Mallory of the Wallace County Citizens Bank stared at his clipboard. Reese Tibbets looked across at Edith Hollander. He said, "Mrs. Hollander, the real estate goes up at 10 o'clock. Do you intend to remain for that portion of the sale?" Edith Hollander, in the third row from the back, in the dark navy wool overcoat, with the original silver tone buttons, with the small black felt hat pinned at an angle on her iron gray hair and the soft black leather purse with the brass clasp on her lap, said, in a voice that was no louder than the voice she had read the letter in, "Yes, Mr. Tibbets, I do." She bid on the home quarter, and she bought it. She bid on the south quarter, and she bought that too. She bid on the 8-row chisel plow and the grain auger and the welding rig and her husband's tools, and she bought every one of them. She had brought, in addition to the cashier's check for $61,420 from the cash value of the policy that morning, the verbal commitment from Carl Yates at State Farm Mutual that the full death benefit of $212,000 would be wired to the First National Bank of Goodland by the close of business that Friday. Bryce Mallory, on the strength of Carl Yates's verbal commitment, accepted Edith Hollander's promissory note for the balance of the estate. She bought every lot she chose to bid on. She did not bid on her own kitchen table because she had already loaded it into the back of the dark green 1976 Chevrolet Caprice station wagon the night before. She walked out of that tent at 5 minutes after 1 in the afternoon with $223,000 of paper obligations on the books at the Wallace County Citizens Bank and a fully paid life insurance benefit on the way to cover them inside of 72 hours. Whit Kearney left the tent before she did, at 12:40, in a hurry, with his stained brown felt cowboy hat low over his eyes. He did not look at Edith Hollander on his way out. The thin gold tooth was not visible. Edith Hollander drove home alone. The 8 miles back to the Hollander place took her 22 minutes, because she stopped once at the Phillips 66 in Sharon Springs to put $4 of gas in the Caprice, and once on the gravel road 2 miles north of her own driveway, because she pulled over and she sat in the car with the engine running and she cried for 19 straight minutes with both hands flat on the steering wheel and her forehead pressed down on the rim of the wheel, and the wedding ring on her left ring finger caught the cold afternoon light. And then she sat up. She wiped her face with a clean white handkerchief she took out of the soft black leather purse. She drove the last 2 miles home. She came up the gravel drive. She parked the Caprice next to the implement barn, where the 1973 John Deere 443 was already sitting, key in the ignition, the way Don had left it on the morning of May the 7th. She walked into the kitchen through the back door, the way she had come in for 34 years. She set her gloves on the kitchen table. She set her hat on the chair where Don had always sat. She set the soft black leather purse with the brass clasp on the kitchen counter. She filled the kettle. She put it on the gas range. She walked into the front parlor. She took the family Bible off the small oak side table next to Don's reading chair. She opened it to the inside back cover, where Don's pencil-printed envelope had been tucked all summer, and where now the empty envelope alone remained, the letter back inside it, folded along his original 3 creases. She set the empty envelope on the side table. She picked up the framed black and white photograph of Don and her on their wedding day in May of 1949. Don in a borrowed dark suit, Edith in a plain calf-length dress and a small veil, the 2 of them standing together on the steps of the Methodist Church in Sharon Springs, and Don's left hand resting on Edith's right shoulder, and Don's wide-open laugh visible in the photograph in a way that you could almost still hear. She held the photograph at arm's length for a long time. The kettle whistled in the kitchen behind her. The wind moved across the wheat stubble out behind the implement barn. The 4430 sat where Don had parked it. The home quarter and the south quarter and the 8-row planter and the chisel plow and the welding rig were all on the books of the Wallace County Citizens Bank as the property of Edith Marie Hollander as of 1 o'clock that afternoon, and the cash that would cover them was on its way from Goodland by Friday. Edith Hollander walked back into the kitchen. She set the photograph down on the kitchen table. She turned off the kettle. She poured 1 cup of coffee. She set it across from her own empty chair, the way she had done every morning since May. Then, for the first time since Don died, she set down a 2nd cup beside it, and she poured a 2nd cup, and she set that one in front of her own chair. She sat down. She unfolded Don's letter. She read it 1 more time. She folded it. She put it back into the envelope. She put the envelope back into the family Bible. She set the Bible on the kitchen table between the 2 cups. She drank her coffee. The other cup sat on the kitchen table across from her, steaming faintly in the cold afternoon light. And that, friends, that is the story. A woman, a dark navy wool overcoat, a small black leather purse, a folded letter on a sheet of yellow school-ruled paper that her husband wrote 5 days before he died, and a private whole-life policy that a young insurance agent named Carl Yates had written quietly out of a small State Farm mutual office in Goodland, Kansas on a cold November day in 1961. $212,000, 21 years, and 7 months of $44 premiums. One Tuesday morning in Wallace County, Kansas, and a 1973 John Deere 443. Oh, that nobody but his widow was ever going to drive.